situation and the situation of human rights defenders in particular on the ground. Elections now is proving to be a point where the increasing pressure of human rights defense is becoming apparent. Kenya, for example, which has been seen as a patient for stability for the past 3, 4, 5 decades in the continent, in election in 2008, the end of it, we all know that what happened. Human rights defenders, when they started recording these violations and have given and cooperated with the international and regional mechanisms like the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, they themselves become a targets because they're having a strong evidence of key actors who have stirred violence in those parts of Kenya. As a result of that, 23 human rights activists and mostly prominent human rights defenders have left the country. So we are now looking at the elections in the sub-region where Sudan now, there's a referendum and election which is scheduled next year. Rwanda, which is now a candidate for a Commonwealth, they have election next year. Uganda, which our headquarters is based in, they will be having election in 2011, after 2 years. Kenya itself also will be having election in 2012, and in between, Burundi and other countries in the sub-region will be having elections, including Tanzania. So elections are being seen here now as a kind of difficult point where human rights defense community will have a tremendous pressure in upholding the rule of law. I will just highlight then some of the challenges faced by HRDs and then continue to suggest some kind of measures we all of us could suggest. But I must also at the outset say that most of our recommendations have found a place in the document which we all studied last night and which are going to bundle today. So I might skip also that to leave here to come up with some time. Human rights organizations tend to be perceived as a political opponent in most of the African countries. In many countries in the region, due to the watchdog role they play NGOs during the elections, the willingness of defenders to speak out on issue which government would like to hide, and the lack of weakness of any form of political opposition. This is a particular challenge for the defenders in Africa and the approaching elections of above mentioned. Furthermore, given that most human rights organizations receive funding from abroad and these governments perceive these national organizations as entities representing and promoting a foreign agenda, and thereby are seen or allegedly seen as a threat to the country's sovereignty. It happens time and again, dictators coming out and name calling for HRDs as a representative of foreign government. This in turn influenced the actions of a diplomatic community on the ground. Recently, most notably in Rwanda, but also to a certain extent in Ethiopia and even Kenya, governments have been increasingly critical and in some cases openly antagonistic to diplomatic pressure and interference, quote unquote, and national affairs, particularly concerning human rights issues. As a result, many diplomatic missions have chosen to take a quiet diplomacy approach that amounts silence. The social context, again, I want to a little bit mention something, also poses a challenge to HRDs. Due to the impact of the past very repressive regimes, there is no real culture of speaking out, and even the culture of civil society mobilizing is limited. This is further accentuated by the lack of strong, highly educated middle classes in most of the countries of the region, willing to serve as watchdog. The business community, for example, is clearly underdeveloped and tend to be either very closely linked to the ruling party, largely umbilicized, or to be in foreign hands. This context influences both the human rights organizations in the regional themselves and also has an impact on the defenders' capacity to mobilize and find ready and willing support base among the general public. Then I will just briefly mention the legal context. Over the course of the last year or so, a number of legal restrictions that criminalize the legitimacy activity of HRDs have been on the increase. The draft anti-homosexual bill, which abundantly has been discussed and which I want just to mention briefly by my predecessor Mandip, is currently before the parliament, seeks to give a legal grounding to ongoing attacks to Uganda's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex community, And if passed under this current form, would represent a significant violation to the country's national, regional, and international legal obligations. We have, and it will be on circulation for those of you who have interested, anti-homosexual, what we call Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights and Constitutional Law, which our network is a member. We have made a legal analysis about the law itself, about the bill itself, which is now under the committee in the parliament. And for those of you who have interest in knowing more about, you can contact our activist here, Mario, who's there, and the papers are on the paper. Of particular concern is the current legislative affront against the rights of defenders, as one country after another in the region has passed or in the process of passing both NGO legislation and media registration statute, which severely restricts and pave the way for the violation of the rights of the defenders. This is across the board. Burundi did, Rwanda is going to do it, Uganda now is doing, Kenya may do it, Tanzania will follow it, Ethiopia have done it. So it means the negative best practice are being now passed from one country to another, and just only small changes take place and it becomes a statute of the book, which is a really very, very big concern for all of us. I don't want to mention few, because of the time, there are so many laws which has been passed in all the countries I mentioned, but I'll just go again to see a number of HRDs who become actually victims of the actions by the state and non-state parties in those contexts. A number of human rights defenders have been victims of killing as a direct response to their human rights work. In Somalia, which is not a member of the Commonwealth, for example, a journalist, among the very few voices speaking out against the massive human rights and humanitarian violations taking place as a result of ongoing fighting in Mogadishu and in the South Central, have at times and again been victims of targeted killing. Human rights researchers has found cases of death threat against the defenders in almost all the countries which we cover. These threats are rarely investigated or charged by the police. The lack of response to these threats create a climate of impunity that encourages these violations. Human rights defenders are regularly harassed and intimidated. Authorities in Ethiopia, for example, have to late been making use of the pro-government media as a channel with which to attack the private media. The Addis Neger, the leading private newspaper, has been regularly threatened in a series of articles in the government papers over the course of the last 2 months, making it clear that if they do not change their policies and stand their fate will be similar to that of the private media journalists followed in 2005 elections. Then there are groups, particularly the marginal groups, who are now facing the brunt of the actions by the state parties, more so than the rest of them. And those are the minorities and women human rights defenders. I have how many minutes? 2 minutes. Okay, I'll summarize it. Lack of community support, especially in campaigns against harmful traditional practice, that the traditional role of women is perceived as integral to a society cultural, thereby making it hard for women, HRDs, to question and oppose aspects of their tradition and the culture. Female genital mutilation is an example of such practice, most of the countries which we cover. In most of the regions, their rights and the rights of those they are defending are not recognized. The threat to gender-based violence and harassment by state and non-state actors having women human rights defenders is very real. Dismissal from employment and official position, personal attacks on women human rights defenders and their families, impunity for acts of violation women human rights defenders classified as women abuse, not a crime. Minority rights defenders, particularly LGBTI community, challenge limited access to resources. That's number one. Most of the LGBTI communities, they don't have a legal presence in their countries, therefore they cannot receive like what other human rights organizations could receive from outside. Then criminalization of sexual minority defenders, direct harassment by authorities and community members, non-recognition of the rights minority HRD advocate, no venue to legal redress due to criminalization,